Hey, Asia. All right, we are rolling. All right, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us for an introduction to greenhouse gas inventorying webinar. I'm Sarah Monson, the Education Communication Director at the Sierra Nevada Alliance. The Sierra Nevada Alliance and Sierra Business Council are excited to once again be partnering to bring information and resources to Sierra communities. In today's webinar, we will explore the importance of greenhouse gas inventorying and empowering communities to take charge of their carbon footprint. These inventories are a crucial component in climate planning, and we're excited to share with you the basics and show you some Sierra examples. I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters. We have Meredith Anderson and Sam Ruderman, Civic Spark Fellows at the Sierra Nevada Alliance. We have mechanical engineer BJ Schmidt, who is the analysis and planning technician at Sierra Business Council, and Paul Arns, program director at Sierra Business Council, who will be sharing with you today. And with that, I will hand it over to Sam.
All right, thank you so much for that intro, Sarah. We're just going to go ahead and get these the screen share going. Bear with me one moment. All right. How does that look?
It looks good, Sam.
Awesome. All right, well, thanks again. Thanks for being here, everybody. Again, my name is Sam Ruderman. I'm one of the Civic Spark Climate Fellows working with the Sierra Nevada Alliance this year. The greenhouse gas inventories for the city of Southlake are one of the projects that we've been working on. So we wanted to share with you some of the stuff that we've learned, as well as some of the results that we found. So I'm gonna start with going over kind of an overview of a greenhouse gas inventory. So what is a greenhouse gas inventory? Basically, what we're doing here is trying to figure out all of the emissions that are coming out of a place during a period of time. So the technical definition is a greenhouse gas inventory quantifies all greenhouse gas emissions associated with a specific boundary during a specific period of time. The specific boundary is going to be potentially a town, a city, could be a county or a state, or even a country. And the specified time period is usually going to be a calendar year. There are two different types of inventories that are relevant to us. Number one, we have a community-wide inventory, and then we have a government or municipal operations inventory. So for community-wide, that's going to be looking at all the emissions that are coming, say, from residential homes. That's one of the sectors. But a government or municipal operations inventory is going to be looking at the emissions attributed to, for example, City Hall. To help guide us in these inventories, we use something called protocols, which are kind of sets of rules or guidelines. The definition of a protocol is that they provide authoritative guidance for communities to account for carbon pollution accurately and consistently. And I think the accurately and consistently part are important parts of that definition, because we want everybody on the same page when we're doing these inventories so that we're able to compare results. So the two inventories that we've used or we've referred to are the U.S. Community Protocol and the Local Government Operations Protocol. So the U.S. Community Protocol was developed by ICLEI, Local Governments and Sustainability, and was released in 2013. And this was designed to inspire and guide U.S. local governments to account for and report on greenhouse gas emissions associated with the communities that they represent. The Local Government Operations Protocol was developed by a few different stakeholders, the California Air Resources Board, the Climate Action Registry, and ICLEI again. And this was designed to provide a standardized set of guidelines to assist local governments in quantifying and reporting greenhouse gas emissions associated with their government operations. So it's really nice. These protocols are actually built into some of the leading software used to inventory. So we use ClearPath, which we'll learn more about later. And the protocols are kind of built into that platform. So it just makes it really easy and helpful for the user that's doing the inventory. So now that you know what an inventory is, why should you think about completing one? Well, number one, we have California climate legislation. There's a couple really important pieces that we wanted to share with you. So SB 32, this builds off AB 32, which is the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006. And this set targets of reducing emissions to 1990s levels by 2020. So we actually hit this goal in 2016. And that same year, Governor Jerry Brown signed into law SB 32, which built off AB 32, but took it a few steps further. And it committed California to reducing emissions by 40% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 80% below those 1990 levels by 2050. So that's what we're working towards now. SB 375 was passed in 2008 and also built off AB 32's goals. This bill directed the California Air Resources Board to set regional targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and it established a bottom-up approach to ensure that cities and counties are involved in the development of regional plans to achieve those targets. So basically what it does is it uses the regional transportation planning process to achieve reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, which are consistent with those AB 32 goals. Other than these climate laws, why else should you be inventorying? Well, first and foremost, you can't manage what you don't measure. So if you're not measuring emissions and taking stock of your emissions, it's going to be really hard to mitigate and reduce them. So number one reason really for completing inventory is to identify the emissions that are coming from your community, where they're coming from, the sources, activities, and sectors that are contributing to these emissions. This is going to be the first step in these sustainability initiatives, this planning, and it's going to act, this inventory, kind of as the foundation for developing a climate action plan. You really need to know what you're emitting and where those emissions are coming from to inform your climate action plan. And that's going to be absolutely pivotal to developing cost-effective policy. So in order to develop policy that cost-effectively reduces emissions, again, you just need to know kind of the relative contribution of each of the sectors, where they're coming from. That way you're not putting your time and effort and money in less effective areas. And then tying back, doing these inventories does demonstrate compliance. It shows the rest of California and your communities around you that you are, sticking to SB 32 and those emissions reduction goals. So those are some of the reasons why we think that you should be inventorying. All right, I'm going to pass it off to Meredith, who will walk you through completing an inventory.
All right, hi everyone. I'm Meredith, and I'm also a Civic Spark Fellow working with Sam at the Alliance. And I'm just going to walk you through how to complete an inventory. So you're looking at establishing boundaries in your baseline year. So for your baseline year, you're going to want to look at an average year, so no extreme environmental or economic factors like intense drought, economic recession, things like that. And this is really important for consistency and comparability across years. And then for your boundary, for your geographic boundary, like Sam mentioned, this could be a city, county, region, state, and it's usually just the operational boundary of that jurisdiction. And with your analysis year, you're choosing a year that'll show changes in emissions over time. And this analysis year will be able to help you establish increments for new inventories. All right, so data collection for your community-wide inventory. I'm not going to list everything since there is a lot going on here. So if you have questions about specific sectors, feel free to ask questions at the end. And we'll also be sending out these slides as well as the recording of the webinar later. So we're looking at residential, commercial, and industrial energy. And this includes grid electricity, natural gas, other stationary fuel combustion, like propane, fuel oil, wood combustion, things like that. And then another large source of emissions would be transportation and mobile sources. You're going to want to be really careful about double counting. So when inputting data, making sure that things are not accounted for twice. And also, every community is different and won't necessarily have all of these activities. So South Lake Tahoe, for example, will have a significant amount of emissions from recreational boating activity, but very little to no emissions from agriculture or industrial energy. So this is a quick example from our data collection for solid waste. So you'll see on the left hand of this slide, this is the solid waste factor set. So this is the proportional breakdown of solid waste by type in South Lake Tahoe. And all of these waste characterization percentages won't add up to 100%, you'll notice, since they're only taking into account what will produce emissions when landfilled. So you'll see that glass, plastics, metals, those are all not included. So this data is from South Tahoe Refuse, and you can either get the waste characterization from CalRecycle or the waste company if they have it available. And you'll see here that about 95% of South Lake Tahoe's waste went to Lockwood landfill near Reno, and they do have a methane collection system. And then about 5% of it went to the Carson City landfill with no methane collection system. And just to put this in perspective, our results indicated that not having a methane collection system in place produces about 5 times more emissions for that same amount of waste. So it's really important to note if there is a methane collection system in place at the receiving landfill, because if it's not collected, emissions are much higher. All right, so for data collection for government operations inventories, they're set up a little bit differently than community-wide. We have a few different sectors: government buildings and facilities, streetlights and traffic signals, vehicle fleet, employee commute, government-generated solid waste. And then if there are other facilities owned and operated by the local government and not a special district, you would include those as well. So this would include wastewater treatment plants, transit fleets, landfills that are within the boundary, things like that. So this is an example from our South Lake Tahoe inventory. This is our employee commute survey that surveyed all city employees about their daily commutes to work. So survey questions included number of days per week commuting to work, mileage for their commute, vehicle type, and fuel type. And then using all this data, you're able to find vehicle miles traveled for each vehicle type and fuel type for the certain year that you're looking at. And as you can see from this response we received, you can't win them all, but out of over 100 responses, there was only one that we couldn't use. So calculating emissions, Sam and I have been using ClearPath, which is an online software provided by ICLEI and the Statewide Energy Efficiency Collaborative, also known as SEEC. So it's free for local governments in California through the Statewide Energy Efficiency Collaborative. There are a ton of different resources in ClearPath. It's used for completing greenhouse gas inventories, forecasting for future emissions, climate action planning, and monitoring. There's also a learning portal where there are really helpful tutorials and other resources for completing inventories. So your data and emissions factors are input to ClearPath, and then total emissions are calculated by sector, source, and activity. And there are also other software platforms that are used, and sometimes consultants also use Excel with their own calculations. So next, going on to emissions by type. So for community-wide inventories, you're looking at direct versus indirect emissions. So direct emissions are coming from sources or activities located within the region. And an example of this could be vehicle miles traveled within the jurisdiction of interest. And then indirect emissions are coming from sources outside of the region, but resulting from activities within. So an example of indirect emissions would be electricity generation, if generated outside of the jurisdiction and then consumed within. And then for your government operations inventory, we're looking at scope emissions. So scope 1 being the same as direct emissions, scope 2 the same as indirect, and then scope 3 would be all other out of boundary emissions. So an example of this would be employee commuting. So employees that are commuting from outside of the jurisdiction to work within the jurisdiction of interest. And it's important to note that categorizing these emissions is also very important to prevent double counting, like I mentioned before. All right, so calculating emissions. In greenhouse gas inventory reporting, CO2 equivalent is the unit used for reporting. So CO2 equivalent, quick definition, is the conversion of all greenhouse gases into a comparable unit by using the global warming potential of each gas. And a quick definition from the EPA of global warming potentials is a measure of how much energy the emissions of 1 ton of a greenhouse gas will absorb over a period of time in relation to the emissions of 1 ton of CO2 over that same time period. So you'll see in this graphic on the right, it's not to scale, but it's definitely still a good illustration of global warming potential. You'll see that methane is 28 times stronger than CO2, and nitrous oxide is 265 times stronger. So this is factored in each calculation when converting to units of CO2 equivalent. All right, so emissions factors. When calculating emissions, this is the equation that's used. It's emissions equals emissions factor multiplied by activity data and then multiplied again by global warming potential. So the simplest definition of an emissions factor is emissions per unit of activity. So this is an example of grid electricity, residential grid electricity in South Lake Tahoe. And this is showing the conversion from methane emissions to CO2 equivalent. So using the calculation I mentioned before, you're looking at 33 pounds of methane emitted per gigawatt hour, electricity consumption of 65 gigawatt hours as the activity data, and then 28 as the global warming potential. And by multiplying all of those, you're getting pounds of CO2 equivalent, and then we're converting that into metric tons to get about 27 metric tons of CO2 equivalent emitted from residential electricity consumption, specifically from methane. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Sam, and he will talk more specifically about our inventory in South Lake Tahoe, as well as how communities will benefit from taking inventory of their emissions.
Awesome. Really quick, I'm going to just check the chat because I see that there's been a bunch of stuff coming in. So
people are wondering if there's a way to make your slides bigger, and then there's just some questions that I told everyone we'll take at the end.
Awesome. Yep. Sorry about that, everyone. If there's you'd like to see again at the end, please, we'll take some time for questions and we'd be happy to switch back Apologize about that. Is that a little better? Hopefully. All right. So yeah, we wanted to walk you through some of the results that we found for our inventories for the city of South Lake Tahoe. Here are those chats. All right. Better. Awesome. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Cool. So yeah, we just wanted to show you some of the results that we found. We did both a community-wide inventory and a government operations inventory. So we just like to show you some of those now. All right. So in our community-wide inventory, we started to get these results after many months of data collection. So it's been nice to actually churn out some results and see where these emissions are coming from. On the community-wide level, we found that the top producing emissions source was the residential energy sector. So this is homes, the heating and electricity there. This is closely followed by the transportation and mobile sources. And third sector that was producing the most emissions was the commercial energy sector, or source. So that's looking at emissions by source, but we can also look at emissions by scope. So as Meredith, went over, scope 1 emissions are those direct emissions, scope 2 are those indirect. So when we look at emissions in the community by scope, we see that the majority of them are scope 1 emissions. They're direct emissions. They're happening from activities that are taking place within the city of South Lake Tahoe boundary. That's about 184,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent being categorized as scope 1. Scope 2 emissions make up about a quarter of all emissions with 66,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And the rest were scope 3. So it's about 22,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And that's for the community-wide. We also wanted to show you the government operations inventory results, which we found had some kind of interesting implications. So you can see pretty quickly that the majority of emissions, nearly 75% of all of the emissions attributed to the city of South Lake Tahoe government, are coming from the buildings and facilities sector. This is closely followed by about a quarter, a little less than that, of emissions in the being attributed to their vehicle fleet. When we think about these results, they seem to make sense to us. The government has a lot of different buildings and facilities. They use a lot of electricity and power and energy, but they also have a pretty large construction fleet for vehicles, as well as a large snow removal fleet for the city of South Lake Tahoe. So those make sense to us. Again, that's emissions by sector, but we also want to change lenses and look at emissions by scope. When we look at the emissions by scope, you see very quickly almost all of the emissions are scope 1. So again, those are the in-boundary direct emissions. There's very few scope 2 and scope 3. We had to kind of take pause when we saw this result, because when we look at buildings and facilities, our first thought was, okay, well, those buildings use a ton of energy, a ton of electricity. But if they were using a lot of electricity and that was contributing highly to the emissions, we'd actually see those emissions pop up in scope 2, because electricity is usually categorized, grid electricity, as a scope 2 emission, because it's energy that's being produced outside of our boundary, but being emitted within our boundary, or from activities taking place within the boundary. So we don't see those scope 2 emissions. So we dug a little deeper. What we found was that the majority of all the emissions that are attributed to the government in South Lake are coming from stationary fuels combustion. It's actually natural gas combustion. So this is a really interesting finding, we thought, because now we can go to the city, we'll tell them, this is where most of your emissions are coming from. This is where you should be putting your time, your effort, your money to tackling your carbon footprint. So it's kind of cool that this was something that we were able to find when we changed our lens from the sector to scope emissions. I wanted to show you this, which was an infographic that Meredith made for the City of South Lake Tahoe City Council. We did a presentation to them a few months ago. This was when our results were a little more preliminary, but we did have some findings. We wanted to give them an overview of where we were. We compared our results to a previous inventory that was completed by the California Tahoe Conservancy in 2013. And this inventory looked at 2005 and 2010 as two different baseline years. So what we did was we took natural gas usage as an example. You can see in the original inventory from the CTC that natural gas usage went up a little bit from 2005 to 2010. But we found in between 2010 and 2015, it actually went down by almost 10%, which we thought was great. For on-road transportation, it's a little different. In 2005, we see 70,000 roughly metric tons of CO2 equivalent, and that dropped by, again, roughly 10% in between 2005 and 2010. We think this is most likely due to the economic downturn. But what we do find for 2015 is that transportation emissions have gone back up. This is something that Tahoe knows is an issue. The TRPA, the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, puts a lot of time and effort into working on transportation planning. So we know that this is an issue where we'll have to be tackling emissions in the future. For government operations, we didn't quite have our results yet, but we wanted to make sure the City Council knew what we were looking at. So these are the sectors that we looked at that Meredith went over. So of course the buildings and facilities, the vehicle fleet, but also the employee commute, solid waste generation, the emissions that are attributed to those. Lastly, we wanted to bring you back to the why. So we wanted to talk more about the benefits that your community will see from doing the inventory. So we've heard some of these already. Number one is identifying emissions. You need to know where they're coming from. This is why we break it down. We figure out what sources, what sectors and activities are contributing emissions. And also we need to know the relative significance of each source. We can't cut what we don't count, so we need to count them and know where they're coming from. This will help us make a historical emissions record and see trends year to year. That's what we saw in that infographic from the last slide of looking at 2005, 2010, 2015. It's important to see how you're doing over time. That's going to be important for informing your climate action plan, knowing where those emissions are coming from, know where they're either increasing or being reduced over time. And that's going to be really important for making those cost-effective decisions, those cost-effective policy measures to reduce emissions. In your climate action plan, you're going to be setting goals and targets. Again, it's just another example of why you need to know where you're at so that when you're setting your goals, you know how much you need to reduce by and when. And that can't really, it'll be hard for that to work moving through the future if you're not monitoring your progress. So one thing we'll talk about in a minute is that you need to be doing these inventories every so often. So it could be every year. That's going to be pretty frequent, but every 3 years or every 5 years, taking stock of your emissions. Another thing that ClearPath, the software that we use, does is it helps forecast emissions. So it'll tell you in a baseline as usual, business as usual scenario, what you could forecast or suspect your emissions will be down the road. You can also work in different policy measures to see how those will affect emissions in your communities. So those are mostly things that we've talked about, but there are definitely some other important benefits that we wanted to mention to you all. Number one is informing the public. When you're doing these inventories, it's really important to be able to, as the government or whoever may be doing them, to reach out and tell the community that you are doing these inventories, that you're taking stock of your emissions. It will help with that community outreach and engagement aspect. And hopefully it helps to motivate some community action. So taking stock of emissions and knowing how your community is performing. If you're not performing so well, hopefully it motivates the community to be a part of the solution themselves. This ties in with being an accountable government and showing that you're a leader. One thing that's really important for the city of South Lake Tahoe is that 2 years ago, they passed the 100% renewable energy resolution, which commits them to 100% renewable electricity by 2030 and 100% renewable energy by 2050. And so part of that resolution was that they said they're going to be conducting these inventories every 3 years. So now they need to do that. And it will show, informing the public and providing that outreach to the public shows that you are sticking true to that goal. Another important benefit is that you'll be able to understand your emissions performance relative to similar communities. So if the town or city down the road from you releases inventory and they're doing great and they've reduced emissions and they're forecasting that they're going to keep reducing, that's probably going to stimulate some action in your community to do your part and be part of the solution again. So really knowing how you're performing compared to those similar communities around you should help keep things rolling and reducing emissions. Lastly, just tying all the way back to the beginning, demonstrating your compliance on a larger scale too. So all of the communities around you, of course, it's great for them to be able to know how you're doing and you want them to know that, but also showing the state of California that the city of South Lake, for example, is part of the solution. They're not part of the problem. They're staying true to their climate goals is really, really important. So that's definitely going to be helpful when in completing an inventory. So thank you so much for listening. We're going to give some time for questions now. If you all would like to unmute yourselves to ask a question, that works, but also it could be good just to throw them in the chat and Sarah can help moderate. We're happy to answer any questions you may have. We also have some really, really special partners today, the Sierra Business Council, and so they are happy to help answer questions as well if we don't have all the answers. So thank you all for listening.
Awesome. So we have one question from Annie, and she has a question about gathering data using the VMT example. And her question is, what do you do if you have an incomplete data set, such as if you don't have many responses from surveys or of employees?
So I can speak to the employee commute survey. So for that, we have there's a total of about a little less than 200 employees at the city of South Lake Tahoe, and we got about 100 responses. So using those 100 responses and doubling that, we use that as the average. And that's kind of how you can make up for a lack of response.
There aren't any current questions in the box, but Deirdre says thank you. This is so helpful. Does anybody else want to ask a question? Another question from Deirdre is, can you talk about the ClearPath software a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. If you have specific questions, please feel free. Basically, it's this pretty great software that's provided, like Meredith mentioned, by ICLEI and the Statewide Energy Efficiency Collaborative for free to local governments. You can definitely purchase the software as well if you're not a local government or the person that's using it doesn't work for the government. But it's an online platform, which is really nice because you can always access it from anywhere. Meredith and I both have our own accounts, so we can both be logged in and working on different calculators, different emissions calculators. It has all of the inputs that you need, so it was really helpful to use actually as we were making our data requests, because we knew, okay, we need kilowatt hours from grid electricity, we need, the customers reached, things like that. It's fairly user friendly. I think there's definitely room for them to grow as well, but as it stands, it's extremely helpful. I mean, Meredith and I didn't have necessarily particular experience doing greenhouse gas inventories. We've both done energy benchmarking and things like that. But to have this software was extremely, extremely important for us to be able to teach ourselves and learn how to do these inventories. It really sets up the whole stage to be able to churn out the emissions calculations.
All right, we've got questions rolling in. So Bob Barrett's wondering, in how many communities has Civic Spark been working? Truckee, and how does the data compare with what you have found in South Lake Tahoe?
In others, okay. So there are Civic Spark Fellows. There are about 50 climate fellows. They're not necessarily all working on greenhouse gas inventories, but they're all working on things like climate action planning, like electric vehicle, fleet transition, things like that. And then as for how South Lake Tahoe compares to other Sierra communities, actually Sierra Business Council is going to talk a little bit about their work in the Sierra and kind of how different communities compare emissions-wise.
Awesome, thank you. Annie Seacrest wants to know, can Sam and Meredith discuss any challenges they encountered during the data gathering process and how they overcame them? For example, were there areas in which you could not gather the data you were seeking? And how did you then account for the void in data? Is there any particular threshold in which guesstimating is acceptable versus not acceptable?
Yeah, that's a great question because it's so relevant. There were definitely some challenges. I'm trying to think of the best examples. For example, prescribed burn data has given us trouble for a while now. Propane companies are less likely to just give you the data, so you have to use sometimes like surrogate data. What we talked about all the way at the beginning was being as absolutely as accurate as we could at trying to find the most accurate data, even if maybe it was overkill at some times, because we knew that we'd have to make some concessions at some point when data wasn't available. So one thing that we didn't mention, I don't think, is using proxy year data. So Liberty doesn't have its 2015 emissions factors for grid electricity. So essentially how many emissions are emitted per gigawatt hour of electricity. So we had to use 2017. So you can't always be perfect. I think at least the stance that we took was doing the absolute best job you can wherever you can, so that when you do have to make those concessions, you minimize your introduced error and uncertainty. One thing that BJ and Paul talked to us about, because they are the experts, they've been doing this stuff for much, much longer than us, was they said, and they'll talk about this more later, so I won't go into it too far, but don't spend all of your time and energy and so much effort on an area where it's very difficult to get the data, for example, when you know that data isn't going to produce substantial emission results. Because if it's adding, a 0.1% to your emissions and you're spending days and days and days trying to get the data, it might not be worth your time. I feel like I missed part of the question there, so I didn't answer it.
Do you want me to reread it for you?
I think I have it here.
Okay.
Yes, accounting for the void in the data. Thank you, though, Sarah. Accounting for the void will definitely be to just ensure that we, are explicit in our report. We're in the report writing stage now. Just being, very clear that we had to use proxy data, or we weren't able to. It was unavailable. So that's, I hope that helped answer your question. If you have more and I only got part of it, or if I didn't answer it, feel free to put that back up in the chat or send me an email later and we'll get back to you.
Nicole Cartwright shared some related information. She says that Tahoe Fire and Fuels team will have a GIS database of fuels treatment for the basin soon. That's
amazing.
Oh, sorry.
I'm glad.
We had a question from Don Ravinas. How much would an updated inventory cost to do?
That is a great question. I am not really sure about that, but I'm sure Sierra Business Council would can answer that a lot better than we can.
Okay, great.
I'm going to talk about a program that they have later, which hopefully will help answer that.
I'll save a few of these questions just in case we need to revisit. All right. Next question. Do you know, from Bob Barrett, is the state of Nevada working on something similar? Comparison with, say, Incline Village, Carson City, or Reno?
It's a great question. The inventory that I referenced, the California Tahoe Conservancy inventory, was basin-wide, so it did look at the Nevada side as well. We did not. Our project was, our beneficiary is the I guess, title of who we work for through Civic Spark, and that was the city of South Lake Tahoe. So we were doing work specifically for them. Of course, it would be great to have updated inventories for the Nevada side of the basin. I know Nevada just passed a new renewable energy bill last week or the week before, so hopefully they're doing progressive things on the energy front, and hopefully those agencies get the money and capacity to be able to do those inventories in the near future.
Thank you. Annie is also wondering, do you know of any helpful resources that you could recommend for guiding inventory development besides the ICLEI guidelines, or are they the main recommended source?
They have a ton of really helpful resources on, so like when you sign up for ClearPath, you'll get access to the learning portal, which has, I want to say, about 60 hours of,
hundreds
tutorials. There's a lot of tutorial resources on there, but also we've found, we just Google our questions a lot of times, and either EPA or different organizations that have also worked on greenhouse gas inventories have really helpful resources as well. So there's stuff out there that's not necessarily tied to ICLEI.
We're pretty fortunate too to have the Civic Spark base, which we've used a little bit. There are other Civic Spark fellows throughout California that are working on these inventories. Some of them are working with big environmental consulting firms as well. So they may have a couple extra resources that we've been able to piggyback on.
Deirdre is wondering, how do you account for methane from forest debris?
You had to throw us a curveball, Deirdre. I believe that that's not within the protocols, I believe. And we're not the experts necessarily. Paul and BJ may have a better answer to that, but it's not built into ClearPath. And I think that's because it's not included in the protocols, probably because it's not necessarily a consideration for a lot of the communities, cities in the US that are doing it. And they want this to be, kind of inclusive and consistent. So we haven't right now. And I know that's probably something that's important for communities in the Sierra. The city of South Lake Tahoe may be a little bit less because it is a little more of an urban setting, but it's something that we're going to write down in our notes now and check back in on.
All right. The only comment I have here is thanks for the information about Nevada and hope something will develop there soon, from Bob Barrett. Any other questions? I think that might be it.
Great.
I've just, this is Bob calling in. How long is the Civic Spark program? I'm looking at the website as the webinar is continuing. Is it planned to go on indefinitely into the future or to be increased? And are there plans to cover lots of communities throughout the Sierra, for example?
Yeah, so we serve an 11-month term, but there are about 90 fellows that serve 11-month terms, like year after year. And I know they're trying to get more folks in the Sierra, and there are also fellows working on water resource issues. as well as affordable housing, broadband access, things like that. Yeah, is that?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is that the program, I believe, is this is either their 5th or 6th year having fellows, and it has grown exponentially over time. And it's, frankly, I feel super well organized and very, very well run and administered by the local government commission. And I think it's only going up from here. I think it will grow over time, and they'll continue to add fellows throughout California, but hopefully more in the Sierra. I know that one thing that they're trying to do is figure out a more effective targeting for communities in the Sierra, specifically rural communities. So I would expect to see more and more fellows placed throughout Sierra communities in the future. And I don't see the program going anywhere soon. I think it's here to last for a while. So I feel like, hope that's helpful, Bob. I feel like we should probably pass it off to Sierra Business Council now because they've got a great presentation and great stuff to share with you all. I want to make sure they have time and have time for questions at the end. So if you have further questions, maybe we can send them through the chat, and I'll get back to you all by email, or feel free to send us an email as well.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Bob.
All right. Is it Paul and BJ? Do you want to share your presentation?
Yes, this is Paul Arns. I will share our presentation now. Give me 1 second. And should be visible now.
Looks good.
And
Yeah.
Hi, I'm BJ. And Paul and I are going to talk to you today about greenhouse gas inventories that Sierra Business Council has done, as well as other energy services that we can provide. Sierra Business Council was formed 25 years ago by a group of business people from across the Sierra with a mission to foster thriving communities through on-the-ground projects that amplify the region's social, natural, and economic assets. We're based in Truckee, California, with remote staff throughout the region, and we work in the entire Sierra Nevada region, from Kern County to Modoc County in the north. Next slide. In 2010, our interns focused on one jurisdiction each to complete 17 municipal operations inventories. In the next year, a few interns were brought back, and we completed 17 community-wide jurisdictions, with each intern taking a deep dive into a specific sector for all of the inventories. That way, we learned a lot about data sources and different methodologies and variations between the jurisdictions. We now work with fewer jurisdictions each year, but we provide both community-wide and municipal operations inventories. Since 2015, we've provided updates to baseline inventories that have already been done, as well as re-inventories for more recent years. And we've also worked on energy action plans and sustainability plans. Next slide. We're going to look at some results. This is for the baseline municipal operations inventories. It includes 17 cities in 8 counties. The cities are on the left, counties on the right. You can see that the range of total emissions is smaller for cities generally, larger for counties that have greater populations and greater land areas. The bars are different sectors. On the right, you can see some of the sectors that can be broken out depending on the jurisdiction. For example, airports can be broken out even though they're usually included in the building sector. If you look at the left axis, you can see total emissions range from a few hundred to about 25,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. The next slide shows results for community-wide baseline inventories. These are mostly, but not exactly, the same jurisdictions as were shown on the previous slide. These are the original baselines that we did back in 2011 or so, and they're plotted against population. So it's a little bit different way of looking at it. The total emissions are the green dots and the green line, and they're noted on the right-hand axis, and they range up to about 2 million metric tons for the larger counties. I want you to notice the one high green dot, that one that Paul's pointing to. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. This is the original baseline inventory, and we did a re-inventory, and that number did come down. The red dots are per person. They're a metric where you can see it's generally more consistent across jurisdictions. There are outliers on the top left that are from small counties, something like maybe a lot of pass-through traffic from a major roadway like a freeway. When these baselines were updated, the outliers were all reduced. For example, the green dot at about 2.5 million metric tons went down to about 1.4. And I'll discuss updating baselines in a later slide. Okay, here are some community-wide results for cities, and it includes baseline inventories and re-inventories at a later date. So you can compare from year to year. The bands represent different sectors, and you can notice that the transportation emissions, which is the dark green band, tends to dominate. The residential and non-residential, which are the two bottom bands, they're both significant. They're kind of similar magnitude across these different jurisdictions. Water and wastewater energy use are broken out at the top. They're the little bands, red and yellow. And those are broken out to provide information on the water energy nexus, which is so important here. The next slide is the community-wide results for counties. Again, transportation dominates. Generally, residential is larger than non-residential, which is different than the cities. And agriculture, which is blue, can be significant when it is included, when it's deemed important and when the data is actually available. And then finally, on the next slide, we're going to take a quick look at a summary of a recent inventory that we did for unincorporated Nevada County. This is county operations summary, and it shows emissions are relatively similar across the sectors. For some jurisdictions, you'll have a sector that really dominates. For example, if you have a regional landfill. The total emissions, they're in the 8,000 to 10,000 metric ton range, CO2 equivalent. And you might notice that emissions fell in every sector between 2005 and 2017. There were good reductions that were due to more efficient PG&E electricity. You can see that in the buildings, facilities, and lighting. But as well, there were reductions from projects and activities at the county. The next slide is the community-wide results for Nevada County, the unincorporated county, so it doesn't include the cities that are in there. Transportation dominates, as is typical. And again, you can see reductions in most sectors, a significant contribution from more efficient PG&E generation, which was also true for municipal operations. And the total emissions are about 500,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And now I'd like to finish up by taking some time to talk about best practices that we've discovered over the years. One of the first things you want to do is to determine what your priorities are, and your jurisdictional staff are going to be the experts. You have to find out, first of all, how involved they want to be, depending on their interests and how available they are. They might be really hands-on, or they might really depend on you to do as much as possible. You want to find out if maybe they want more detail in certain sectors than you might otherwise do. So stay in close contact with your staff, with the jurisdictional staff. You need to be sure to choose inventory years with good available data. 1990 is the state's baseline, but there is not good data going back that far. We found that 2005 or 2010 is about as far back as you can go for a baseline. And for the current inventory, you probably still have to go back a year or two because current data isn't available. So maybe now you could get good data for 2017. It's really good to analyze multiple years of data, allowing for comparisons and identifying trends, as we saw with South Lake Tahoe. And it also helps identify outliers. Per capita and per employee metrics allow for more accurate comparisons between communities You can look at statewide averages and compare to those. You have to be really careful when you're comparing because methods and reporting frameworks can change, and they need to be consistent if you're going to be comparing. Good record keeping is really important for replicating results. To carefully document your communications, who you get information from and when that happened, because you might get inconsistent data from different people at different times, and good record keeping really helps straighten that out. And it's really important to keep good records of your raw data. You want to use consistent methods across your inventory years. The protocols change and methodologies get updated and better data becomes available. When you do an updated inventory, you may have to redo your baseline so they're consistent. For example, transportation emissions used to generally be based on total miles traveled in a jurisdiction. So anything within the boundary, any vehicle travel would be included in the miles for the activity data. Origin destination models are preferred now when they're available, and those exclude all the pass-through traffic, which can be huge in some of these jurisdictions. And the origin destination models only include half of the miles for trips that begin or end outside the jurisdiction. So that means emissions are usually much less using that. And that was one of the reasons that one green dot outlier was reduced from about 2.2 million down to about 1.4 million metric tons. A lot of that was an updated transportation protocol methodology and better data. We got origin destination data. As we talked about earlier, it's important that you spend your data conditioning effort on sectors with the greatest emissions. There are sectors with minimal emissions that can have very raw data and lots of it. So if that's the case, you want to find an efficient methodology if possible, even if you lose a little bit of accuracy. Information item reporting is an important tool that you can use to report relevant sectors and to prevent double counting. Next, you want to be sure you have consistency between your municipal operations and your community-wide inventories. For example, you might have a city that operates a regional wastewater treatment plant that treats water from inside the city as well as outside the city. So one of your inventories might include all of the plant emissions, and the other one might only include emissions from wastewater generated inside the city boundaries. So they can be really different, but you have to be clear and carefully explain what's included and how they might be different. Quality control of data conditioning and emissions calculations and report writing are key to catching mistakes early and ensuring that your final results are accurate. And lastly, most readers only want to read a high-level overview, but it's really important to include your detailed information so that future staff or consultants can understand exactly how those emissions were developed. We like to put the summary and overview in the report body, and then all the technical information in the appendices. So that's it for what I'm going to share today. I'm going to pass this over to Paul, and he's going to talk to you about how these inventories are used to inform energy and climate action planning. Thank you. Paul?
Thank you, BJ. This is Paul Ahrens, Program Director with the Sierra Business Council, managing our climate and energy program. I was also one of the first interns back in 2010 alongside BJ, working with, I think, a total of 15 of us on doing baseline municipal operations inventories. The baseline greenhouse gas inventory is really the first step in an energy or climate action plan. It's the starting point for where the rest of the work originates from. It's critical, though, throughout the process to involve jurisdictional staff across departments and the community throughout the process to ensure that the final product, an energy or climate action plan or sustainability plan, is actionable and capacity is built within the community and staff. The next steps after a baseline greenhouse gas inventory is completed is to forecast emissions out into the future under a business as usual scenario. This takes energy use or emissions and holds kind of per capita, per person or per employment numbers constant, and increases or decreases the emissions based on changes in that population, employment, or households metric. In general, business as usual forecasts increase over time as communities are expected to grow, though that's not always the case in Sierra jurisdiction. The business as usual forecast gives you a more accurate estimation of where emissions will go in the future so that the full scale of emissions reductions can be quantified, and allows for the identification of the strategies that are needed in order to meet future targets. This is an example of a business as usual forecast that was completed for the town of Truckee. We recently worked with to do their baseline and reinventory of greenhouse gas emissions. The business as usual forecast, or BAU forecast, showed that emissions would increase about 20% from their 2008 baseline out to 2050 if there was no actions taken either locally or by the state. As we know, this isn't true, and the state has actions that have been taken and will be required to be taken into the future. So the next step is actually to do an adjusted scenario forecast that takes into account these regulatory influences. Specifically, the two big ones are the state's clean car standards, which are requiring improvements in vehicle efficiency of new cars and promotion of electric vehicles and zero emission vehicles. And then the renewable portfolio standard, which requires utilities to procure renewable electricity. This adjusted scenario showed a decrease in emissions from the 2008 baseline of 26% in 2050. Obviously, this is a great that these actions are being taken, though it's still not enough of a reduction in order to meet the state's goals of 80% reduction below 1990 levels by 2050. So there is additional work that needs to be done locally. Also, it's worth noting that this scenario was done before the SB 100 was recently passed that required utilities to meet 100% renewable electricity by 2045. So there would be additional reductions beyond the ones shown out to 2030. There are significant benefits for jurisdictions for completing an energy or climate action plan. First, it can help with identification of energy and cost savings within the community, both at jurisdictions' facilities and for residents and businesses. Strategies that they can do to reduce their energy use or their emissions cost effectively and saving money over time. It can also be a roadmap for the jurisdiction to identify how targets can be met cost effectively over time. It builds capacity in the community for action by incorporating that community throughout the process. There will be more action that can be completed in order to meet goals that are needed to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. Additionally, jurisdictions can improve their grant competitiveness by showing early actions and can help with applying for grants from the California Energy Commission, California Climate Investments, and other state programs that either require this work to have been done already in the jurisdiction or will likely require it in the future. Can also help jurisdictions prepare for future unfunded state mandates by completing an energy or climate action plan on their terms. They can do it without the mandate before it is mandated by the state. It can help prepare for future general plan update requirements so that when that time comes for jurisdiction, they are ready to fully address climate change. Additionally, completion of a qualified climate action plan can be used for CEQA streamlining for future development projects that are consistent with the climate action plan, And this is just for analysis of the climate change impact. The rest of the CEQA analysis of other environmental impacts would still be required for future development projects. Additionally, communities can benefit from an energy or climate action plan through reduced energy costs, lower utility bills or lower transportation costs, through improved energy efficiency and electric vehicle use, improved air quality both indoors by reduced fossil fuel use in the home and outdoor through reduced vehicle emissions and outdoor fossil fuel emissions. It can also lead to improved health and comfort at homes and businesses by reducing the need for energy, reducing the amount of energy that is needed to heat and cool homes, make it so that they are more comfortable with while using less energy. Local renewable energy and battery storage can also be used to improve flexibility for meeting energy demand locally without the need to import electricity and fossil fuels from outside of the region. This can also improve the resiliency of the community because they can produce their own energy locally, and water efficiency measures can also improve the resiliency of the community to future drought and other weather impacts. Finally, projects that come out of an energy or climate action plan can spur economic growth within the community, since there is still significant work that would be needed to be done in order to meet goals within these plans. That work translates to jobs within the community and energy savings, bill savings after the completion of those projects can then be reinvested locally, boosting local businesses and services. Over the years, we've learned a few best practices for the development of these type of plans to make sure that they are actually implementable and do not just sit on a shelf gathering dust. One is the inclusion of a timeline matrix that prioritizes actions into an achievable 3 to 4 year short timeline and identifies responsible departments, potential funding and implementation partners to help complete actions. It's important to identify the responsible departments in order to ensure that there is capacity and the willingness to complete actions. And we recommend using programs that are low or no cost in order to leverage the limited capacity and funding that is available within the region. One of those programs that we use to help with implementation is the Civic Spark AmeriCorps program that Sam and Meredith are a part of. We have a fellow working right now with the city of Grass Valley to help with their implementation of their energy action plan. The program is amazing because it can bring highly trained young professionals into our region to help build capacity. Additionally, we recommend convening a community working group that can be organized to assist with implementation efforts in the community, promoting programs that are available and ensuring that the community supports the work that is being done. Finally, we recommend measuring progress over time through annual progress reports that can track measure activity, and then completing re-inventories every 3 to 5 years in order to measure the overall progress towards meeting targets. And then finally, the plans should be updated as needed to ensure that targets are on track and incorporate new technology and innovations in project design that can be incorporated and rolled out in the community. The SBC, Sierra Business Council, provides numerous services, some of which can be provided at no cost through our partnership with PG&E to jurisdictions that are located within their service territory. This includes greenhouse gas inventories, facility benchmarking, and energy action plans. Additionally, SBC provides climate action and adaptation planning services through fee-for-service contracts to other jurisdictions outside of PG&E service territory, as well as those within. Finally, our Sierra Nevada Energy Watch program also works with jurisdictions to facilitate community working groups and implement energy efficiency projects. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions. I know we are right at 11:31, so you can also send questions by email or give me a call if you have any other questions.
All right, I'm looking at the questions. Thanks, Paul from Angel Green or Onhub. Not exactly sure. Sorry about that. Any other questions? You're welcome to unmute yourself as well. Annie Seacrest has a question from BJ's presentation. What is information item reporting? BJ, are you still on?
I am. I'm looking for my unmute button. So information item reporting is so that you can include things that might not be reported when you're using a protocol and trying to be protocol compliant. If it can also include things that are biogenic, like burning wood, which since it's biogenic, does not get included in the total emissions. You can use it to report. Paul, do you have can you come up with any good examples?
I think one that we often do is reporting electric vehicle emissions as an information item within the community transportation sector. And that's because it's related to community transportation, though the emissions are also captured in the residential and non-residential energy sectors.
All right. There's another.
Important not to.
Oh, sorry, go for it, Paul.
Sorry, it's important to do that in order to not double count the emissions in multiple sectors.
Paul, another question for you. Can you share again the potential funding sources? You mentioned them when discussing increased grant competitiveness with CAPs.
Yes, I just briefly touched on the California Energy Commission has multiple programs. One of their largest is the EPIC program, which funds kind of innovations in energy, kind of energy innovations. They also provide no cost or 0% and 1% loans to do energy efficiency analysis, both at facilities and schools for all public agencies. The California Climate Investments is kind of the large umbrella for all of the programs that are funded through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is the cap and trade program in California. And so there are, I think, over 20 different programs that are implemented through that program. One is the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities Grant Program that provides funding for affordable housing projects throughout the state, as well as sustainability measures that are implemented as part of those projects. I can share some of those resources by email. We also have our Sierra Climate Adaptation and Mitigation Partnership, or Sierra CAMP, which does a really good job of updating its members of funding sources as they become available, since there are always new programs out there. So I'm happy to connect anyone that's interested in that group as well.
Thanks, Paul. Deirdre is wondering when and where the slides and replay will be available. I'll be downloading the recording right after this, and I'm happy to send that out. And if Paul and BJ and Sam and Meredith want to send me all their slides, I can attach the slides as well. And if there's any other resources, Paul, that you would like to share, if you want to send them to me, I can send them to everybody who signed up for the presentation today. You should get that email within the next 2 days. Any final questions? All right, well, thank you all so much for joining, and a big thank you to Paul and BJ and Sam and Meredith for sharing your knowledge on this topic. Really appreciate it. Any final words from any of our presenters? Great, thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and end this meeting.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining.